As we continue our evaluating labor market models discussion, I'd like now to turn to looking at, once again, the slopes of the curves, shifts of curves, and movements along the curves. We've actually talked about each of these various elements already in some of the other segments in this module, but I want to bring them together in a coordinated segment. So let's first take a look at the demand relationship. We're going to use the demand equation that we've used in several segments already of this module. Labor demand is equal to 20 minus the wage, or 20 minus W. I've given us a table that is informed by these two equations, labor supply and labor demand, at which I've given us wages starting with 0 and increasing by 2 units of wage, or $2 of wage perhaps, and then seeing how that changes the labor supply and the labor demand. Well, of course we understand that when we do this, this table can inform a set of curves that we can plot. So let's think about those curves in our XY space. We have our labor, or x-axis, wage, or y-axis, and we see here that when the wage is 0, the labor demand is 20. So when the wage is 0, which it is at this point, 0, labor demand is 20. And we see that, let's say, when the wage is 8, the labor demand is 12. So when the wage is, say, 8, labor demand is out here at about 12. So wage of 0, labor demand 20, wage of 8, labor demand 12. And let's say that when the wage is 16, there's a labor demand of 4. So the wage is relatively high. At 16, there's a labor demand of 4. It's going to give us a curve that now we see is beginning to be a negatively sloped curve. If I had done my plotting of wage and labor demand nice and proportionately, then we would end up with this labor demand curve that we've seen before, going from 20 to 20. I've actually, as you can see here, I haven't plotted this proportionately very nicely. I probably should have put my 12 about here, and that would then put us on the curve. So what we're seeing here is that any change in wage will simply cause a movement along the labor demand curve. Any change in units of labor demand would similarly cause a movement along the labor demand curve. So this would be a movement along the curve. In fact, you're going to find that when we're looking at curves or lines in XY space, that any change in either of the variables, in this case wage and labor, that define this space will simply move us along the curve illustrated in this same space. It won't create a shift of the curve, it will simply move us along this curve. Well, in that case, let's consider what might create a shift of the curve. Well, if a change in either of the two variables, wage and labor, cause a movement along the curve, then a change in any other variable that could possibly have an effect on this labor demand would cause shifts of the curve, either shifting the curve out or perhaps shifting the curve in. And recall that when we say out and in, we're really thinking up and down, or increasing, decreasing the quantity of labor. So a increase of a labor demand curve would actually be shifting it out and to the right. A decrease of the labor demand curve would be shifting it in and to the left. Well, if we think about what other kinds of variables might affect the form, shape, or placement of this curve in this XY space, we'll think about those more clearly in the labor demand characteristics module. But let's say that the overall taste and preferences for the good being manufactured increased. That would then require or yield an increase in the labor demanded to manufacture those goods. It would cause the curve to shift out and to the right, let's say. Or if we saw some climatic conditions that cause the demand for this good, let's say that it's a recreation good, and the climatic conditions cause very poor weather, we might see a shift in this curve. So this would be shifts of the curve rather than movements along the curve. Let's get rid of those for a moment. Let's think of how that might present itself equationally. We have labor demand equaling 20 minus W. What if labor demand equaled 10 minus W? Well, to begin with, one of the things we're going to see is that we have a negatively sloped labor demand curve because the operator in front of the scalar that leads the variable W, in this case the scalar would be 1, negative 1 W, that has remained constant. That would suggest to us that we're going to end up with a curve that is parallel to our existing labor demand curve, but it's going to have a different starting level on the labor demand axis. So think about this: when the wage is equal to 0, what is labor demand equal to? Well, labor demand is equal to 10. So let's come and restructure our labor demand column here. We'll give it another column, LD prime, let's say. And when the wage is 0, the labor demand is 10. When the wage is 2, labor demand is 8, and then 6, 4, 2, 0, minus 2, minus 4, minus 6, and minus 8. Notice that I didn't do this simply by subtracting 10 from each of these values, although it does somewhat look like that. What I did was I recognized that for a change in wage of 2, that I found also a change in labor demand of 2. So an increase in wage of 2 brought about a negative or a decrease in labor demand of 2. That's because we have a negative 1 scalar in front of the right-hand variable. And once I've identified that some constant change in wage brings about a change in 2, a decrease in 2 of labor, I just applied that all the way down. Well, what would this plot out like? How's this going to look for us? Let's change our color here so we can see it just slightly more conveniently. Now we see that a wage of 0, so which we are on the L or x-axis, a wage of 0 is going to bring about a labor demand of 10. So let's say this is our 10. A wage of 8 will bring about a labor demand of 2. So wage of 8. Now we're going to have a labor demand, let's say it's out here at 2. Say that's 2. And then that's going to suggest to us that at a wage of 10, we're going to have a labor demand of 0. So wage of 10, which might be here, we have a labor demand of 0, which gives us simply a movement in this labor demand curve. We've gone from this LD originally to some LD prime. It is shifted inward. So that's how we think about the supply equation. Now let's apply these same conditions or same thoughts to the labor supply equation. We're going to look at this in exactly the same way. We'll think about our XY coordinates now, where we have labor and we have wage. And now let's think about how we are constructing this curve in this space. So at a wage of 0, we have labor supply of negative 10. Well, that's out here somewhere, and we've decided we don't really enjoy working in negative space all the time. It may not even be necessary. So let's find a point of wage where we have a positive labor supply. So at a wage of 4, we see a labor supply of 2. So let's say that our wage of 4 could be here. Our labor supply of 2 perhaps would be here. And let's also think a little bit further here. At a wage of 10, our labor supply would be 10. So let's say that our wage of 10, our labor supply then 10, and we have an upward sloping curve that we'll call labor supply. Well, again, anytime we see a movement in either wage or quantity, so something on the wage axis or the labor axis, the x-axis, quantity axis, we find that that's going to simply move us along the curve. So instead of 4 and 2, if the wage is 10, then we expect the labor units to be 10. Or instead of, let's say, labor units of, let's say, 6 in the supply equation, or let's say 8, labor units of 8, we would expect that that's going to then yield us some new wage, and we can just look at our graphic here and we see it's going to yield us a wage of 6. So it's simply going to cause some movement along the curve. Well, what would cause a shift of this curve? Well, obviously, it's going to be something other than a change in wage or a change in the labor units. It might be, if this is labor supply, we know that labor is supplied by individuals, come from households, and so maybe a change in their leisure decisions, maybe a change in their perceived opportunity cost of an hour that they might put at labor, maybe a change in some exogenous factors that that cause them to not be satisfied with a certain level of wage at a given level of labor. So let's think how this might actually give us shifts of these curves. So if we found that people began to value their leisure time more, that would suggest that they would like to have more compensation for their labor. Well, how might this look? We're going to find that we want some kind of increase in wage at a given level of labor. So here we have a level of labor 2, which we're satisfied with a wage of 4. What if that given level of labor of 2 required a wage of 6? Well, we would see that we'd be here, or let's say a level of labor of 10 required a wage of perhaps 14. We'd be out here, and we would see a new labor supply curve emerge that we might call LS prime. Well, let's go ahead and get rid of that so I can create yet another one by maybe manipulating the actual labor supply relationship. What if we found that this was the case? Well, then we would think about this in terms of an outward shift here, or rather an inward shift rather, because what we're thinking about is at the same wage we would actually have less labor applied, less labor supply itself, given the parameters that I just suggested. So now let's think about this. That might be a new labor supply relation that was LS, we'll call it prime, is equal to maybe negative 15 plus 3W. That we're using the same positive operator, the same scalar in front of the variable of 3, would tell us that we're going to have the same slope. So it's going to simply be a parallel line to our original labor supply curve. Let's go ahead and think about how we might plot this. So when we have a labor supply with a wage of 0, we are at now negative 15. I'm giving us a new labor supply column so that we're going to be negative 15. When we have a wage of 2, then we're going to have negative 15 plus 6, or negative 9. Notice that we're still moving by 6, just as we did in this structure. So now it's negative 3, 3, 9, 15, 21, 27, 33, and 39. So again, as you would expect, as the wage is increasing, the labor supply increases. So let's go ahead and work once again in positive space. So at a wage of 6, we have a supply of 3. So at a wage of 6, we have supply, let's say, of 3. It's going to give us a point right here. At a wage of 10, we now have a supply of 15. So wage of 10, our supply is out here at 15. So 10 and 15. This is actually going to begin to look like it's a different slope. So let me see if I did this correctly. That is a change of 6. So at a wage of 10, a labor supply of 15. And so what we're actually telling ourselves here is I didn't plot some of this very, very artistically. But what we should end up with is some increase, or rather decrease, in labor supply, because we've shifted to the left in terms of our quantities at a given wage, and this would be then a shift of the curve. What happens to the entire structure and equilibriums when these curves begin to shift, or when we're moving along these curves? So let's take a look here. And consider, once again, both of our equations. Consider that we have used our table, or we've created our table here based upon the equations, and we have now, let's say, this articulated labor demand and labor supply relationship with these values that are informed by the equations that might be able to be observed on the table. But let's consider here, we don't see on the table neatly a wage of 7.5 or labor of 7.5. We know that those are our market clearing or equilibrium levels because of our equations, but we don't see them on the table very neatly. In fact, we see at a wage of 6 that labor supply is 8 and demand is 14, and recognize that demand is greater than supply there. At a wage of 8, we have a labor supply of 14 and labor demand of 12. So now the relationship has changed. Now supply is greater than demand here. So we know that somewhere between 6 and 7, the equilibrium value of wage is achieved. And we happen to know by our equations that that's 7.5. We also were able to identify our intercepts based upon these equations. We could have identified intercepts perhaps by having extended our table to a point where we saw labor supplies and labor demands at 0, but we would have had to extend those a bit. It's easier to rely on our relationships here. So what happens if a wage is imposed on this, or from the demand side? Let's say that firms, for whatever reason, have decided that they're going to provide a wage of 10 to the market. So let's say we have a new wage, we'll call it W prime, and let's say that's equal to 10. Well, we know a few things are going to take place here. We know to begin with, we can identify exactly what labor demand will be when a wage is 10. When the wage is 10, labor demand is 10. But we also know that when a wage is 10, labor supply is 20. So actually my curves haven't lined up all that well again in terms of the proportionality of my where I've placed wage here, because 20 is out here, but we're just going to pretend that it has lined up and that actually is the 20 point. What this is telling us, though, is that at a wage, we have demand not equal to supply. Now, what this might do is, if this is not exogenously imposed, if there's just something internal to the markets, internal to the decision-making processes of the firm that have caused the firm to decide to go ahead and pay $10, we might see that that's going to cause a shift in the labor supply curve. Recognize that at 10, the firm requires fewer workers, in which case we might see this shift to a new equilibrium if this was endogenous. If it was not endogenous, though, let's say that it was exogenous, it was some outside interference, it was some contract, it was some government, then what this would do is it didn't really change the labor demand relationship. It didn't change the labor supply expectations. It just changed the wage. Maybe this was an imposition of a high minimum wage, well above $7.50. And this is the type of minimum wage change that we're actually hearing about, thinking about in our marketplace. Minimum wage isn't currently at $7.50, of course, but this is let's say it's a new minimum wage at 10. Then we would see now a mismatch in our labor supply and our labor demand, such that we know that we have some kind of, in this case, we'd see or expect some kind of unemployment.